Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, November 25th, 2023. We begin with a special relay coming from Prison Radio as we hear from Eddie Treadwell, currently held captive in Alger Correctional Facility in Munising, Michigan. He's bringing us a message today about transformation while in prison. After that, Dr. Gerald Horne will be in conversation with Sean Kingsley, co-author of the book Enslaved, The Sunken History of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. This marine archaeologist and our very own world historian will be sure to shed some light on the subject matter of Kingsley's book and much more, so stay tuned for yet another informative discussion. Then, in the second half of our program, we'll be getting started with yet another prison radio relay, this time from none other than Baba Mumia Abu Jamal at SCI Mahanoy in Pennsylvania. This time, he's bringing us a special tribute to Abdul John. Next up, we'll be hearing from Professor R.J.M. Blackett, Andrew Jackson Professor of History Emeritus at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. For our purposes today, he's the author of the book Samuel Ringle Ward, A Life of Struggle. Stay tuned to find out more about this lesser-known figure in our long history. Now, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Bob Marley and the Wailers, Eric Reed, Conrad Herwig, Tito Puente, Miles Davis, and Robin Eubanks. Now, people, get ready for this train to come and taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for a message from Eddie Treadwell on Prison Radio, followed by a conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne and Sean Kingsley.
Creation. Hello, this is Eddie Treadwell in Michigan prison system of Brooks Correctional Facility. My prison number is 205017. And I would like to speak a little bit about what do it take for a prisoner to rehabilitate itself or reform, from a life of crime, And, I come to understand and realize throughout my 33 years in prison is that we have to have a desire to change. We have to have a desire to think our conditions could be better, opposed to police always looking over your shoulder for the police, trying to get a quick buck. You get out of life what you work for, So we have to work and strive towards accomplishing something that's worthy of our attention, right? Worthy of our presence, right? You want to create something that's great, something that's, something that's lasting. You don't want to have no short-lived type of activities going on. You want to do something that make you feel that sense of purpose. You have a sense of purpose to engage in these particular activities in which you engage in, right? And through transforming yourself from the old you to a new, mature you, then you see that the prison system have actually worked for you. See, because if I was still in the street, I'll be a whole different entire person. I wouldn't be who I am today. The prison experiences have helped shape and mold me to be the intelligent, thoughtful, caring person that I have come to be today. So prison is not all that bad, right, when you really look at it. For certain individuals, most times I would say, the individuals leave prison worse off than they did when they came to prison, if they're doing short-term sentences. They say those who gain the highest heights must reach the lowest depths. So once you don't reach the lowest depths within yourself by being in prison for all these years with nowhere to go, but up, you go down inside of yourself and reflect on who you is and find them treasures that's hidden beneath the rocky soil of who you are. Then we grab them up and pull them up and show them off as pearls, right? But the thing is with that is that we have to give what we received through our study, through our experiences. We have to give it away, right? We have to share with others. Then it's like, it gives you a sense of satisfaction of accomplishing something, because you open those eyes that was closed, right? You had a tendency to uplift spirits and restore hope in others, right? And it just brings you a sense of satisfaction just simply for the act of giving, right? It says, isn't it better to give than to receive, right? So I transformed myself from being just a regular individual to an individual who's caring, an individual who see life in a different light than I did before I came to be incarcerated. So I understand and recognize the benefits to me of being locked up. I went out in the street drinking all day, partying, listening to all the music, doing what most people do from the inner city. Right. I had time to sit back and reflect and study and read and ponder on life, and what it means to be a man, and an individual connected in the community. How do I become to be an asset to the community opposed to a detriment? Right. So I just want to just share that, with the people that we as prisoners, we do what we do to help and assist others, not so much for the sake of go get early release or provide us with a certain incentive to get good time or extra meal or whatever the case may be. We do it from the kindness of our hearts. We have study groups and classes that we run in prison, and we don't get paid a dime. But for the act of giving, the information and knowledge that we received and what we done derived to the certain truth that we done derived at, we feel a sense of satisfaction by sharing it with others. So we have to just not just be good, but be good for something. So with that, I'm going to leave you as I came, but if anybody like to contact me or communicate, my name is Eddie Treadwell, 205-017. I'm in Brooks Correctional Facility in Michigan. Have a great day.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
For KPFK Los Angeles Pacifica, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Sean Kingsley, co-author of the book Enslaved, The Sunken History of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Sean Kingsley.
Hello, Gerald. Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for joining us. So why did you and your co-authors decide to produce this book?
Well, I'm a marine archaeologist. I've been diving for over 30 years. There's a lot of shipwrecks, a lot of stories out there. 3 million wrecks in the world's seas. I was part of a team in the English Channel that happened to find 200 shipwrecks in those waters. And some of them were first-rate warships, English warships that everyone got very excited about. But actually, there was one anomaly at 110 meters depth that no one had seen anything like it before. It was an English trader, it had cannon on it, and it had these, what we call these signature sets of material and finds, which were intimately associated with the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Copper manila bracelets that were the currency of barter in West Africa, and elephant tusks. These are two commodities that just kind of stank of guilt. And it was from that we identified that as the world's earliest Royal African Company slave trader that had ever been found. And from that, I got involved in the television series with Samuel L. Jackson, and then Simcha Jakubowicz, who was he's really the brains behind this project and the director of the film. He asked me to co-author this book. Shipwrecks are something that, they're fun and exploration and it's sexy and people get excited about it. But it's very rare. But it's very rare that you work on a subject that really absolutely was of the moment and matters. When we were writing the book and making the film, of course, the Black Lives Matter exploded. This very subject was one of the most important aspects of the era. Statues were being pulled down. It seemed to us slave wrecks are incredibly rare. They're even rarer than pirate ships. There's maybe 1,020 slave wrecks, we believe, out there amongst the 3 million shipwrecks worldwide. And maybe we know 10 of them. And I would say less than 5 have been properly excavated. So, the hatches of sunken history have stayed bolted for too long. And of course, you got all these statistics around the transatlantic slave trade. 12.8 million Africans trafficked. 1.7 million died on the Middle Passage. What does that even mean? For me, when I looked at those statistics and I understood the broad horizon of this subject before I got into it as a historian and marine archaeologist, but, I can't visualize what that means. Your mind melts and it closes down. But when you find shipwrecks with things on it and objects, those are very tangible and you have an emotional response. And a lot of the divers from Diving with a Purpose had exactly this reaction. And that gets you into a new kind of way to disrupt those statistics and try and understand this horror of horrors.
Now, I think I heard you say that the actor Samuel L. Jackson was involved in a television project with your enterprise. And my question is, besides, I presume, narrating the television series, where can the television series be accessed?
I was on EPEX MGM, and I believe it's still available on Amazon Prime. I was a small player in the TV series, which I thought was wonderful and incredibly emotional and powerful. And I understand this was very much a labor of love for Samuel L. Jackson, who was co-producer of that series. And if anyone hasn't seen it, I would highly recommend it. I'm a hard-nosed scientist, but I have to say at the end of every episode, I had a bit of a tear in my eye.
So your book discusses at length the nation we know as Suriname on the northern coast of South America. You mentioned in passing that Suriname was the site of rebellion, strikes, suicides, sabotage. Two questions arise. Why the focus on Suriname? Is it because there were many wrecks found off the coast of Suriname? And secondly, do you have any idea of what part of Africa the bulk of Surinamese came from?
Yeah, so the Diving with a Purpose team that worked on the film, and we've also, we kind of honored that structure in the book as well. They went looking for 9 shipwrecks, which is more than anybody had ever gone looking before in America, Canada, the UK, Costa Rica, and as you say, Suriname. And some of them had been found, and they were joining other projects and getting to, up close and personal with artifacts. But in Suriname, had a very distinct history in that a ship called the Loisden, which was a Dutch slaving vessel, went down in 1738. And we know that that particular ship had gone from the great slave trading port of Elmina in Ghana, the Gold Coast. And it was heading to Paramaribo in Suriname. And it had 664 enslaved African people on it. Now you ask, why Suriname? What's so important in Suriname? It's very easy. Once the Dutch lost control of Brazil, they turned to Suriname for the most important commodity in the world in the colonial period for making money. It wasn't crude oil, it was sugar. Sugar and slaves were the biggest ticket in town. And the Dutch had about 120 sugar plantations scattered around Suriname. And, it's an amazing statistic. Tea leaves shipped 10,000 miles were then blended with sugar exported 5,000 miles, all of which were processed by Africans who didn't want to be trafficked to these plantations another 4,000 miles to make this tea sweet for people. So that was what was going on in Suriname. Now, this ship, the Loisden, it was heading for a specific port, and the weather drew in. It was bad conditions, and they missed it. And they went up a different river called the Moroni River, and they hit a sandbank, and that was the beginning of the end. And there were these 664 enslaved people on it, and rather than freeing them, they could have easily made their way to shore, which was well within sight, and perhaps joined some of these maroon communities in the outback. The Dutch decided to bolt the hatches and sit on until dawn as the ship slowly descended into the water and the mud until the voices stopped screaming. And it was the largest human massacre in the Transatlantic Slave Trade period over all those hundreds of years. So that's the reason that divers wanted to go looking for that shipwreck with a Dutch team out of Amsterdam. And they threw all kinds of technology on it, including magnetometers to pick up magnetic anomalies, but they didn't find it. And to that day, those voices are still quiet out there. And, they'd like to raise consciousness, and someday that will be discovered.
Also, Sean Kingsley, you talk at length about the maroon community in Suriname. What do you mean with your invoking of that phrase, that word? And secondly, there is a sentence in your book on page 50 that is astonishing. You speak of how there was a 200-year war up until 1863, when slavery was abolished, between the Maroons and their presumed captors. Could you describe that?
So Maroons were West African workers, slaves, who said, nah, I've had enough of that. And every year, 1,500 enslaved people in Suriname, they head for the hills. They ran off, which was incredibly dangerous to do, because if you get caught, you're going to end up on the end of a rope. And there are lots of engravings and descriptions of atrocious incidents in Suriname. But, they actually found that a lot of the landscape in Suriname was quite similar to their homelands, and they would head out to parts of the outback where the white man, the Europeans, just weren't willing to go. And, they made communities, and those communities survived for decades and centuries. Maroon, I believe, is a Dutch word which means people gone wild in the outback. And it became a term for a kind of cattle, a kind of animal. And at some point, the Dutch realized they couldn't pacify these Maroon communities, so they made a peace deal with them, which still stands today. But my understanding is the Suriname government doesn't recognize really their situation. I mean, the Bribri community in Costa Rica that we talk about, and virtually any indigenous population you want to think about in the Americas has a very special kind of protected status today. The Maroons don't. They're seen as a Stone Age people that shouldn't be there, are taking up valuable real estate that it could be better used for ecotourism or cutting down the trees or mining. So they're an inconvenient truth. And it just shows how the horror and the tragedy of the transatlantic slave trade just echoes down the centuries still.
Parenthetically, it occurs to me that this year, 2023, marks the 200th anniversary of a major slave uprising of the enslaved workers in a neighbor of Suriname, speaking of today's Guyana. And interestingly enough, a descendant of the enslaver population, speaking of the Gladstones, recently arrived in Guyana to a raucous welcome. He only brought an apology, not reparations. And I'm wondering if there was any spillover from the rebelliousness in Suriname into its neighbor, today's Guyana.
I'm afraid we didn't really research into Guyana, but there was certainly always a lot of hearing and keeping an eye on what other communities were doing, and if it worked, imitating it. So, for instance, from Cuba to Santo Domingo, there were always a lot of slave trades, and they kind of echoed and created a sort of snowball effect. But you bring up a very interesting point there about apologies for their parts in the slave trade. And as you were speaking, I was just thinking about one area that we did visit in the book Enslaved, which is Portugal. And in Lagos, which is ground zero for the international transatlantic slave trade, they began to import human beings in the early 15th century, around 1420. A few years ago, the Portuguese were doing some development work. Somebody wanted to create a new multi-story car park, and unfortunately, they ran into 158 human skeletons. And by the beads and various features, it was very clear that these were West Africans who'd been imported. Some of them didn't survive the crossing, others had all kinds of diseases, and because they weren't Christian, they would not be buried inside the city walls of Lagos. So they were thrown into pits close to the harbour with the lepers and with animal bones before the archaeologists dug them up and did a good job on that. But, rather than creating a memorial there or a monument, I mean, goodness, Portugal and Spain, they're full of statues of conquistadors. This could have been a great opportunity to shine a light on what actually happened in the past, but they didn't. What did they do in Lagos? They built a mini golf course over this cemetery. And Portugal consisted of 50% of the whole humans who were trafficked in the entire arc of the transatlantic slave trade. Yet Portugal and Spain, to this day, they have not apologized for their part in that tragedy.
Now, back to Suriname, in that country, and I take it on the land of the Maroons, you can clarify that, there is bauxite, gold, timber. My larger question is there any evidence of U.S. corporate interests seeking to exploit these resources?
Well, Gerald, I'm a humble archaeologist. I'm not a politician, and I'm sorry, that's just not something that we've looked into it. But, big corporations are behind so much of the triggers and the commodities that greased the transatlantic slave trade. You think of sugar, you think of palm oil. Anything is possible in that regard.
Finally, Sean Kingsley, co-author of the book Enslaved, the Sunken History of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. On page 208, you say marine archaeology, your chosen field, quote, messes with your mind, unquote. What did you mean by that? What did you and your co-author mean?
Goodness knows why I wrote that. I guess. So on land in archaeology, things are very systematic. People live in a town, they live in a home, they die, the next generation moves on, a hurricane hits, an earthquake, that house falls down, and everything moves along, it progresses, and those materials are recycled into the future. That's not the same with marine archaeology. When a ship goes down, it's a tragedy. It's something that should not be there. And that ship becomes a kind of time capsule. Everything that is on it is frozen in time. And you think about the environmental preservation, which is the kind of the wonder of the deep. You just don't get that on land. So the whole wooden hull can be there. You can get clothes, you can get organic material. You can study the mud inside the bilge of a ship to find out what the last meal of those enslaved people were. So, when you're talking about underwater archaeology and shipwrecks, and I think that's why this is, as a resource, is so important for trying to understand and look behind the rug of the transatlantic slave trade, in terms of what is down there, it is a tale of the unexpected.
Well, Sean Kingsley, co-author of the book Enslaved, the Sunken History of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on KPFK Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles, Freedom Now.
My pleasure.
I, Abdul John, presenting. He was born Michael Allen Jones on December 1st, 1949. But many knew him by his movement name, I, Abdul John, a long-standing MOVE supporter, social activist, and all-around rebel. As a young man, then a member of the U.S. military, he was on his way stateside when he tossed a grenade into an officer's quarters. Instead of coming home, he was sent to the brig at Leavenworth. In the 1970s, at the height of MOVE conflicts with police, MOVE member Pan Africa would often protest standing alone. Abdul, seeing this, couldn't bear to do nothing, so he would join her. Before long, both would end up either jailed or in a hospital, often left with broken bones. No matter what, Abdul kept on rolling. That protective instinct stuck with Abdul, and it never left him. When people came from other cities to protest in Philly, when they left to drive home, Abdul would often accompany them to their car. I, Abdul John, was a talented photographer. In the fall of 1981, Abdul and I went up to Rochester, New York, after a group of moved men and women were arrested on federal charges. Abdul and I were on assignment for the Philadelphia Tribune. He as photographer, I, the reporter. His photos helped make the articles come alive. The articles revealed a stark dichotomy between MOVE's treatment in Philadelphia and Rochester. MOVE was doing the same thing in both cities, but they were demonized by media in one city and left alone in the other. What a difference the media made. I, Abdul John, was a father and grandfather of a real host of kids. Nathaniel, David, Michael, Tariq, Malik, Shamira, Carlin, Brahim, Yaman, Rashad, Ibrahim, and Carl Christian. As Wadia used to tell me often, Abdul is a good brother. He returns to his ancestors after 74 winters in America. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
Welcome back here on Freedom Now, and thank you to Prison Radio for keeping us connected with our brothers and sisters held captive by the U.S. injustice system. It is now time for more historical contextual breakdowns with Dr. Gerald Horne, who's now being joined on the line by Professor R.J.M. Blackett. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
For Pacifica Radio Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now. And with me on the line is Professor R.J.M. Blackett, Andrew Jackson Professor of History Emeritus at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, and author of the book Samuel Ringle Ward, A Life of Struggle. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Blackett.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. So, who was Samuel Ringle Ward, and why did you decide to write a book about him?
Samuel Ringgold Ward was a prominent 19th century African-American Congregationalist minister who was very active in the abolitionist movement, and who left his imprint on America, on his contemporary history, but about who we know very little. Because Ward, as we will see, goes into exile in the middle of the 1850s, and unlike many of his contemporaries, he never returned to the United States. Ward was born in slavery on the eastern shore of Maryland, exactly where we do not know. His parents escaped when he was just under 3, so he has little recollection of slavery, and they escaped to southern New Jersey before moving on to New York City, where Ward was educated and then moves on to become involved in the anti-slavery movement.
So on page 10, you talk about a riot in New York City where you indicated that he spent time involving 7,000 to 8,000 Euro-Americans. Why did they riot? Describe the riot, and I take it takes place around July 4th. Was that some way to mark that holiday? And does that play a role in leading him into exile?
Ward is he is about 16 at this point, and that riot is centered around opposition to the abolitionist movement. Their organization of a New York anti-slavery society, and the opposition to it that was whipped up by certain newspapers in the city who were thoroughly opposed to any sort of organized abolitionist activity. There was a lot of destruction of property. not any, as we know, loss of life, but a group of abolitionists, young men, and Ward became involved here, resisted the second assault. It was 2 waves of assault on the abolitionists. The second, for which he was, and the others, a couple of others were arrested, and he was put in prison. And to some extent, I argue that this became, this propelled him into organized abolitionist movement involvement. So this was a serious anti-abolitionist riot, one of many that occurred in the United States in the 1830s and 1840s. Many of them, those in Philadelphia, leading to loss of life and destruction of property. But this was Ward's first experience with this sort of anti-Black, anti-abolitionist agitation.
So his cousin was Henry Highland Garnett. Who was he?
Garnett again is another one of those who was born into slavery and escaped with his family. That was one wing of the Ward's Garnett family. The Garnett's names were not Garnett when they were in slavery. They changed their name once they got to New York. But there were 3 wings of the movement, and it's the only time that I know where you have 3 elements of a family, of an extended family, who escaped from slavery at roughly within a short space of time. The Garnetts went to New York. Ward's family went first to New Jersey before joining the Garnetts in New York City, and the other wing of the Ward family moved to Philadelphia, where they had their first child, the parents, who would become a prominent, one of the leading bishops in the AME Church in California later on in the century. So this is a very prominent, I think, enslaved family that would later on become very involved in the larger movement for civil rights in the United States. And Henry Highland Garnett became famous for his speech in 1848, in which he called on the enslaved to rise up and destroy their masters. And of course, this violated many of the principles, the non-violent principles of the anti-slavery movement at the time. So Garnett became a major figure, and he too would go to Jamaica as a missionary of all things of the Scottish Presbyterian Church. That was before Ward arrived in Jamaica. We could talk more about that later.
Mm-hmm. So in 1849, Samuel Ringgold Ward debates his comrade, Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, on the issue of the U.S. Constitution and slavery. What position did these 2 men take on that issue?
Well, for those of you who are familiar with Frederick Douglass, Douglass at this point is in a period of transition away from his affiliation with the Garrisonian wing of the abolitionist movement, which argued that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. Douglass, particularly after he returns from England in 1846 and his establishment of the North Star, is slowly drifting away from that kind of Garrisonian movement. But he isn't quite there yet. Ward, on the other hand, takes the position that the Constitution as a document has inherent in it an anti-slavery possibility. And that is one way that we could approach, that we ought to struggle for the right of the enslaved to be free and blacks to win their rights as full citizens. And Ward's position differs from Douglass. Douglass in 1849 is still playing around with the possibility of supporting anti-slavery political party. In this case, the successor to the Liberty Party. Ward, on the other hand, is a staunch believer in the Liberty Party. He's a big player in the Liberty Party, and he is insisting that one should not vote for any party that has within its ranks slaveholders or people who support slavery. So you can't support the Whigs, you can't support the Democrats. That leaves you with the Liberty Party. On the other hand, Douglas is partial, as I said, to the Free Soil Party. The Free Soils Party candidate in 1848 is a former Democrat who is, as the Democrats are, still partial to slavery. So that is that's what we know is the basis of the debate in this situation. And I should add that Ward and Douglas had their differences, but those differences never developed to any sort of acrimonious level. They remained civil, and they continued to work together at different moments during the 1840s to win particularly the rights of blacks in New York to reclaim the vote that had been denied them in 1821. So that's basically the differences between the two.
Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, Samuel Ringgold Ward decides to choose exile in Canada in the first instance. Why did he do that? When did he do it? And why was he more pro-Canada than pro-US?
Well, Ward leaves, the precipitating event is his participation in the Jerry Rescue in Syracuse in 1850, in the 1851, in the wake of the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law. Ward, I should add, had on two previous occasions thought very seriously of leaving the United States because he thought it just was not living up to its promise, and it kept denying him and other blacks the rights to participate fully in the system. But the passage of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law compelled him, like many others, to decide to go into exile. And his participation in the Jerry Rescue becomes the event that forces him to leave. Because remember, in 1851, Ward is still a fugitive slave, legally, although he has been living free since 3 months of age after his parents' escape. But under the laws of the land, he is still a fugitive slave and liable to be recaptured. So I think this prompted him, along with other things. By 1851, he is deeply in debt and growing increasingly frustrated with his inability to make ends meet. And those things combined pushes him to decide to go to Canada. And in going to Canada, he simply said he was no longer American. He said to Frederick Douglass, take the country and all its craziness, it's yours, you deal with it, I'm leaving. And he moves to Canada.
Mm-hmm. Now, he was also critical of the Christian church. The sentence that I recall is that he sees the keystone of U.S. religion as hatred of the Negro. Why would he say that?
Well, he was part of a movement that believed that people should come out of all churches that continued to not take up an anti-slavery position. So there's a whole group of sort of independent church ministers, and keep in mind that Ward becomes the first black man in the antebellum period, and I think, although I may be mistaken about this, in the entire 19th century, to minister to a white congregation. He does it twice. So he is a person who is deeply committed to the idea that the church has to be independent of all the craziness around slavery and discrimination. And any church that doesn't, and any black person who belongs to such a church needs to come out from under it. Now, that's easier said than done. But that was Ward's position.
Mm-hmm. And by 1855, he chooses exile again, this time in Jamaica. Why is that?
Yeah. Well, Ward, since 1853, Ward had been canvassing in Britain for the Canadian Anti-Slavery Society, raising funds very successfully for the work among freed people or ex-slaves and their families who had moved to Canada in the wake of the 1850 fugitive slave. And by 1855, Ward was beginning again his inability to make ends meet, his sense that there were little prospects either in Canada or the United States for him. And while he was lecturing in Britain, an Englishman, a Quaker from Essex, who owned land in Jamaica, offered Ward part of his land, and they understood that Ward would cultivate the land on free labor principles, and whatever produce they produced could be sold in the United States, and so hopefully undermine the country's commitment to slave labor produce. It was part and parcel of that wider free labor movement that had its origin in British agitation against West Indian slavery. And Ward uses this as a reason for going to Jamaica.
Mm-hmm. And while in Jamaica, it was in 1865 that you have an epical event, speaking of what has been referred to as the Morant Bay Rebellion, where 85 folks, mostly African, are shot or hanged without trial, 358 executed after court-martial, 1,000 homes burned, yet Samuel Ringle Ward endorses, or at least does not oppose, the authorities. With regard to this, now, after reading your book, I came to the conclusion that he felt so indebted to London, and of course Canada was an appendage of London, because of its abolitionism and because of its oftentimes crossing swords with the United States, that he felt duty-bound to support London, even when they're massacring Black people. What do you say, Professor Blackett?
Yeah, that is one of the great ironies of the man, one of the contradictions of his life. And I am not totally convinced that I have come around to a successful and reasonable explanation of why Ward did what he did. Listen, Ward would argue, if I'm speaking for Ward, that he is not supporting, the British government is, in 1865, in the wake of the Morant Bay Rebellion, is not supporting the action of the governor, because they recall the governor to England, and he goes through a lot of agony and pain in investigating his actions back in Jamaica. But look, Ward moves to Jamaica, I think, as a last resort. He arrives at a time when the Jamaican economy and the society is in deep trouble. Hurricanes, people migrating, crops failing, drought, the economy is in a mess. The landless folks, those who had been agitating for more land since emancipation in 1838, are still demanding land, which is being denied both by the landlords and by the local government. And Ward's position is this. He says to the landless people, you are the soul and the future of this island. Do not be distracted, do not be led away by people with political ambition. And so he's saying to them in countless lectures that and speeches that he gives around Morant Bay Rebellion, he's pleading with them to remain patient, because their future is the future of the island, not the governors, not the landowners, not any of the merchants of Kingston. So he takes a sort of independent position on this. But part of Ward's position is also influenced by his deep dislike of one of the leaders of the Moran Bay Rebellion, who, contrary to everything else that Ward had done in his life before, criticizes the guy because he's a mulatto. And evidently, he and this character had crossed swords earlier on, and Ward was not a man to forgive people who cross swords. So he was deeply opposed to this individual as a leader of the Moran Bay Rebellion, and he thought he was leading people astray. That said, I still can't explain why he supported the government.
Mm-hmm.
I just can't explain it. There's nothing in Ward's background that would lead you to think he would do something like that.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps that will be the topic of another book. Speaking of Professor Blackett's, Andrew Jackson, Professor of History Emeritus at Vanderbilt University, author of the book Samuel Ringgold Ward, A Life of Struggle. What's next on your research agenda? What do your readers have to look forward to?
Oh, man. It is something completely out of character, and there's something that I have not done before, but I am writing a history of football, soccer, in Trinidad and Tobago.
Oh, I see.
Going back from its founding in 1908 to 2006, when Trinidad and Tobago were the smallest island to ever play in the World Cup.
Mm-hmm.
So I am trying to understand the social, political, economic, and cultural features of the sport and what it does and how it's influenced by developments through colonialism and into independence.
And of course, as I understand it, your roots are in Trinidad and Tobago, so
Yes.
you're returning home.
Yes, it gives me an opportunity to reconnect.
Right on. So with that, Professor Blackett, Andrew Jackson, Professor of History Emeritus at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
That great man, V.I. Lenin, at the turn of the century, wrote a book entitled Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Is it? Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism? Yes. If one would read this little pamphlet, one would see here that Mr. Lenin had precisely pointed out that all of the world had already been conquered and divided by colonial powers. There was no else in the world left to be conquered or divided by colonial powers. This is the time when Zionism comes to rise. Zionism comes to look for a state when everywhere else in the world is already dominated. Thus, in order for Mr. Herzl to get a country for Zionists, what he did was to attach himself to imperialism, British imperialism in this case, quite specifically. Of course, as an African who suffered under the heels of British imperialism, I can have no love for it, and certainly I cannot love anyone who attaches themselves to it for the foundation of a state and then call this a liberation movement. Liberation movements fight against imperialism, not with it. Clearly here. Yes. The legal foundation of the State of Israel is what is known as the Balfour Declaration. This declaration was issued in 1917. A man in the government of Britain named Balfour wrote a paper and promised the Jews a national home. The national home he promised them was an area which Britain was colonizing, Palestine. Palestine didn't belong to the British, just like Ireland doesn't belong to the British, even though they have troops there. But here, these British imperialists signed a note and gave it to the Jews, and they accepted it. Where is the morality for this? If you say that Israel belongs to you, then you don't go to a thief to get Israel, you go and take it. Once you go to an immoral being such as British imperialism, and this is the basis for you getting the land, then clearly here those who are truly liberation fighters must question this. basis we say is the Balfour Declaration, and Zionists know it. The Zionism is certainly not a liberation movement because it never fought against any imperialism. As a matter of fact, today, Zionism is the baby, child, and infant protector of imperialism in the Middle East. It carries out the interests of American imperialism. As a matter of fact, Zionism and American imperialism is like this. If our tax dollars would stop giving money to Israel, the state would sink tomorrow. And certainly no one can deny that American imperialism is the leading imperialist nation in the world. So we cannot see how a liberation movement is so tied, string, and ham to American imperialism. They work hand in hand with American imperialism. Thus, they can hardly be a liberation movement.
Grant you have favor. They will always want to control you forever. So if a fire make it burn.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Sean Kingsley. Get to your favorite black-owned bookstore and find his book, Enslaved, The Sunken History of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Next up, thank you to R.J.M. Blackett from Vanderbilt University. While you're in that bookstore you know and love, grab his book, Ringle Ward, A Life of Struggle. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone, Babadida and Kamathi. Many thanks to Prison Radio for keeping us connected to our family held behind bars, including Eddie Treadwell and Baba Mumia Abu Jamal. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters out there. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.